ever get out alive? They wanted to know. I kept my tone calm even though this talk excited me. As part of the peace treaty, we helped the N-men with certain specialized tasks. Being only 10 million people, they don't have the same access to specialists, and we've assisted them on different occasions. Everyone nodded, since it was commonly known that the Northlands was a wild and primitive place, and that the N-men were the black sheep of the human race. No one expected them to be as technologically evolved or as enlightened as us. Teaching the class on the N-men was one of my favorite things in the world, because the students were soaking up my every word, and the element of mystery and adventure spoke to me. I should be getting back to today's lecture, but couldn't help indulging myself a few moments longer. The pictures I'll be showing you will include a portrait of our very own Michelle Knight, standing next to the first president of the Northlands. That photo was taken just after they signed the peace treaty. Always the teacher, I asked, "Raise your hand if you know who Michelle Knight was." 11 hands went up in the air, but I nodded to a young woman whose smooth dark skin and frizzy black hair reminded me of my lovely roommate Kaya. Michelle Knight was among the first 101 councilwomen to serve the Motherlands, and she was one of the 3 delegates who negotiated the peace treaty with the N-men 13 years after the Toxic War ended, the youngster said matter-of-factly. That's right. It was lucky that they didn't kidnap her, she added. Everyone knows that the N-men kidnap and rape women. They used to, I said firmly, and that's why we made the peace treaty with them and why we secure our borders to the north. I held up a hand to the 5 students who had their hands raised. No more questions about the N-men. Today we're going to focus on the Toxic War. The open faces and curious glances that had just been looking at me with their full attention turned downwards. Not many people shared my passion for the past, and most avoided talking about it. We were all raised to focus on the present and be optimistic about the future. Sadly, the past represented grief and regret, and the consensus was that there was no reason to dwell on it. You, I pointed to a blonde girl on the first row. Tell me what you know about the war. She squirmed in her seat and her eyes looked upward, making me suspect that she had an implant and was accessing the wise share. The Toxic War broke out in 2057 after decades of political disturbance across the world. It was the breach of treaties and an escalation of cyber attacks on neighboring countries that made the UN fall apart and former allies attack each other. She frowned as if reading in her mind's eye. And then, I asked her to move along. And then it became an endless spiral of retaliation, and by the end of 2060, the world was almost completely destroyed. True. I nodded my head and pointed to the student to her left. Can you tell me how the war affected the geography of the world? He nodded. Yes, large areas became uninhabitable because of radiation and pollution from chemical weapons. And can you name those areas? It was the area formerly known as Africa, Amia, the eastern part of Russia, and Europe. Not Amia, it was called Asia. I corrected him. Sorry, Asia. And what areas are still inhabitable? I pointed to the young man who had smiled brightly at the beginning of the class. What was formerly known as Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, South America, North America, and the western part of Russia. Thank you. I pushed up from the desk and crossed my arms. And of course, one of the first things the council did was to eliminate the old-fashioned idea of countries, so we are now all simply residents of the Motherlands. I was losing their interest but kept pushing. Why did the council get rid of country names? No one raised their hand, so again I had to point to someone. I don't know, she said with an uninterested shrug. Because it was the mindset of them and us that caused the wars to begin with. I clapped my hands to get them to look at me. Who wants to tell me what happened after the war ended in the fall of 2060? The young man with the bright smile raised his hand and waved it almost enthusiastically. Yes? The population was reduced from 8 billion to only 1.5 billion, with women outnumbering men 26-1. There was a general blame on male pride and aggression as being the trigger for the near destruction of the planet, and that's why protective laws were made to make sure greedy and power-hungry men can never rule again. I nodded and pointed to